Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Logistics Executive TV. I'm Kim Winter, your host. And I'm joined today by a gentleman who's deeply involved in the supply chains of Australia and Oceania. He is the director and co-founder of the Freight and Trade Alliance, the FTA, based in Sydney in Australia, and runs the secretariat for the Australian Peak Shippers Association as well. I'm very pleased to welcome Paul Zalai. Hey, Paul, how are you going?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Kim. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, great to see you again. And look, I wanted to have a chat today with you about general supply chains, freight and trade movements around Australia. Australia, of course, a country the size of the US, but with only about 25 million people living there, and a fair way out of a lot of major trade routes, albeit a major producer and a bit of a food bowl and manufacturing bowl for the Asia-Pacific region. So maybe we can start by talking about some of the dynamics that have occurred just recently. But before we do that, what I'd like to get you to give a brief on is just what the responsibilities for the Freight and Trade Alliance are.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Look, Freight and Trade Alliance has been in existence for 10 years. As you said, I was the co-founder of that. And we had a vision to be a representative body, but to be a bit more holistic than some of the niche areas that look after particular elements of the service providers and the like. And we've come a long way in achieving that. We're now representative of 480 corporate businesses. Mainly international freight forwarding companies, but increasing number of major importers as well. And probably one of the big turning points for us was just over 5 years ago now, we also took on the secretariat role for another industry association called the Australian Peak Shippers Association. So don't get confused by the word shippers. Some people think you're representing the shipping lines. No, we're not. It's the shippers. So a lot of Australia's major exporters. And APSA has a hybrid membership of both, again, corporates, so a lot of the major exporters, but also other industry associations, including the wool exporters, the cotton shippers, the Australian Meat Industry Council, the Horticulture Export-Importer Association, and the like. So while we're not an expert on all of those different commodities, our common thread is that we know a bit about moving cargo in metal sea freight containers. So that's where we provide that holistic support and a holistic voice to our government and other key stakeholders.
So from an advocacy point of view, Paul?
Yeah, so look, we do provide some commercial services, including compliance training, particularly for our licensed customs brokers, and also in the area of biosecurity, which is obviously, as you said, Australia is a food bowl, so biosecurity is a major issue here in Australia, and there's a heavy compliance regime around that, so we provide some training there. But yeah, definitely advocacy. We spend a fair bit of time in our nation's capital, Canberra, meeting with politicians, ministers, and also working with other stakeholders, including shipping line, airline, terminal operators, and others, and trying to always looking for improved processes and looking for manageable compliance strategies as well for our membership.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that, Paul. I want to jump straight into one of the more dynamic areas for trade currently in the Oceania, APAC region right now. We're coming up to the Lunar New Year, of course, and we're aware of some of the dynamics that have occurred recently in China, which is still the world's leading manufacturing base and a major lane sector in particular into Australia, as well as outbound for a lot of the primary products and the coal and steel, of course, products. So currently, major disruption. The Chinese have just come out of this major lockdown of COVID. A lot more people traveling. What's happening with the trade lanes at the moment? And do you see Lunar New Year being a major disruption for supply chains because of the fact that there's really a series of weeks now where there's going to be less production out of China?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Look, I actually think the Lunar and the Chinese New Year period it's actually a blessing at this time, because we were preparing for it. We knew that was coming. It's an annual event where the manufacturing does close down. So, as you said, with the outbreak of COVID, and we still don't really know the full extent of it, but if it was going to happen any time, I suppose this was a good time, because a lot of our importers and exporters were preparing for a quieter period anyway. That has been extended. We've got some feedback from some manufacturers that, they're basically taking a couple of months off, the textile manufacturers and the others, so that there is an extended period longer than what was expected. But look, I think one of the other trends that we've seen over the last few years is an increase of importers holding more stock onshore anyway, just with all the disruption to international trade over the last few years. They've moved away from a reliance on a just-in-time inventory, going to the just-in-case environment, and have been holding a lot of stock. So that's helped our importers and our retailers in that they were already sort of geared up for that. The other thing too, which is, I suppose, a bit unfortunate, is, we are expecting an economic downturn with interest rates going up and the like. So there's probably going to be a less of a demand on goods than what we've seen over the last few years. So, look, it's not a great picture, but it's a picture that hopefully is going to be manageable, and that, going back to China, that the impacts aren't too severe and aren't too long, that, coming out of the Chinese New Year period, that we can get back to some semblance of normality. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in Australia, we cast our view to the Australian market. We've heard that the Australian regulators are reviewing, well, of course, during the last couple of years, the disruption of the last couple of years, the Australian federal government and state governments, but led by federal government, took a number of initiatives to ensure freight and trade lanes, or the freight moved through various trade lanes. You and I have spoken at the top end of the show about what they were doing for air freight to make sure that air cargo operators were able to still operate in and out of Australia sustainably, to make sure that a lot of our exports could still move. And you were involved in a lot of that as well, with the organisations that were key to that. And we hear that the Australian regulators are now reviewing the maritime logistics system. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, just going back over the last couple of years during the COVID period, and again, when we saw what was happening in China in late 2019, early 2020, and that, international borders were closing and the like, I don't think anyone really knew what we were about to enter into. We didn't know whether it was going to lead to a major depression or recession or what. And look, at the time, a lot of the shipping lines probably were also scared of what the impacts were going to be, reduced a lot of the capacity. But as it turned out, we had a boom in demand because governments in the Western world were injecting funds to stimulate economies. People were cashed up. They couldn't use it on leisure activities or the like, so they bought goods, and they had to buy some goods too with work from home. One of our members is Officeworks. Well, they said they sold a lot of desks here in Australia and other home office equipment, so we actually had a peak demand, which created some other problems for us with congestion, not just here but around the world. But you also mentioned the air freight. Look, the federal government was pretty impressive, as were the various departments, and they implemented this program called IFAM, which basically provided funding through freight forwarding companies through to exporters to basically offset a lot of the costs to reach markets. And it kept a lot of the airlines going, and it kept freight capacity available. Look, it wasn't perfect, but the government did a pretty sensational job with no notice. They brought in some key people with a lot of experience in commerce, and they did a sensational job. And it was a vital part of the freight sector's sustainability during a very difficult time. We also worked closely with the Australian Taxation Office and with the Customs Department and others, and we had a tremendous working relationship, and it just goes to show how effective government can work in a crisis. Some would argue we might need a crisis more often to get things happening, but it was probably a good news story amongst all the pain that industry went through at that time. So wind the clock forward a couple of years after that. Look, we went and saw the Trade Minister in Canberra early last year, and he was very proud at the time to announce that there's going to be a free trade agreement between Australia and India and other parts of the world. And we pushed back to the minister at the time saying, look, that's fantastic, but it's going to count for little if we can't get our cargo on ships. Which was a problem that we were facing. There was a lack of capacity to the subcontinent and the Middle East and other key markets. And I think we pushed the point long and hard enough that we eventually got the government to commit to tasking the Productivity Commission, who's an independent body with economists and legal experts on board, to review Australia's maritime logistics system. So they've gone through an extensive consultation period. They produced a draft report last year. They handed a final report to the federal government in December. And to our surprise, the final report was released only a few days ago. The federal government had up to 25 parliamentary sitting days before they had to release that document, which would have been around mid-March, and that's when we were expecting to see it. But it actually came out a lot earlier, and I think that's a good thing and gives us an opportunity to work through the issues and move forward.
Excellent. And I guess that leads into the issue of the general spectre of the trade environment, especially in regards to industrial relations in Australia. And Australia has a little bit of a past of some fairly major disruptions, especially on the port side, the water side, very strong, still strongly unionised environment, of course. We've seen in the US over the last year or two a lot of disruption around ports, drivers, but in particular on the ports and terminals side. What's the current environment there? Currently, we've got a Labor government in there, which supposedly is more leaning towards more towards the workers. How are things going between both sides of the equation in regards to employers and employees on the water side and the waterfront?
Look, I think it'd be fair to say there's still ongoing tension between the workers and the employees, the unions. And look, in an Australian environment, the stevedores operate under these enterprise bargaining agreements, which generally last for about 3 years. The last round, each of the Australian stevedores had varying levels of difficulty dealing with the unions on this. The unions have a legal means of, I suppose, causing disruption, if you like, through what's called protected industrial action. So it's a legal action that they can take, which, in theory should have enough impact to make their point, but not cause devastating impacts to the broader industry. And they use that protected industrial action quite extensively. So each of the different stevedores went through the process, with the last of those being Patrick's, who late last year finally came to terms with the union and they sorted out their issues. We also had a similar issue with one of the major tugboat operators with Svitzer, which is owned by Maersk. and that got pretty ugly towards the end. And late last year, it got to the point where Svitzer used what we called the nuclear option and actually set a date where they were going to lock out their staff. And you can imagine that if we weren't going to have a major tugboat operator servicing our ships, we were going to be in big trouble. But anyway, at the 11th hour, there was a level of resolution with the Fair Work Commission intervening, and they've basically bought us time. There's a 6-month period now where there can be no action taken by either party, and hopefully they can sort out their differences during that time. The Productivity Commission made a whole range of different recommendations in its review that's released this week. The one that we were particularly interested in was in relation to making a application to our regulator, the Fair Work Commission. Last year, when Patrick's were at an impasse with the stevedores, we were looking to get involved to try and put an application into the Fair Work Commission on the grounds of economic impacts, because a lot of our members were being severely impacted by the action there at the waterfront, particularly some of our major exports through regional New South Wales. The legal advice that we got at the time is that we'd probably be unsuccessful with that application because we, as an industry body, are not directly affected by the action. That the application would have to be taken out by one or several of our actual members. You can appreciate that the members weren't that keen to do so because they were concerned about potential repercussions to their businesses, and we never made that application. And the protected industrial action lingered on probably longer than what we would have really liked. So one of the things that we were pushing, and to our satisfaction, the Productivity Commission actually picked up on our recommendation, and they put forward to the federal government that an industry representative body or a third party like ourselves should be able to put in an application to the Fair Work Commission with sufficient evidence to demonstrate that there's economic impacts without having to be directly impacted ourselves. So that's probably the main issue that we've been pushing for, and we may be successful in achieving. But there's a whole range of other measures being looked at, and it's really the nuts and bolts of their engagement between the employer and employee, which we've sort of stayed a bit more removed from.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing that insight, Paul, into the workings of the way the Productivity Commission works. Excuse me. It's always been a fairly major organisation in the trade and freight scene in Australia. Paul, finally, just to wrap, perhaps you could give us a bit of a view from your perspective. 2023, what does it hold? I hear just recently, yesterday, that there was $32 billion spent on Black Friday in Australia. So much higher revenues in retail than expected. What are you seeing happening in the trade scene in Australia? Is it a positive outlook for 223? Are the recessionary factors going to have an overly heavy impact? What's your general view?
Yeah, Kim, it's an interesting question. My form hasn't been good. It was a bit like trying to pick who's going to win a game in the opening rounds of the World Cup. I don't think I got one right. But anyway, I think we'd have to anticipate that we are going to see some economic downturn this year, and we can even see it now with the role that we play with APSA and our dealing with the shipping line consortia. We're seeing more and more blank sailings, and I think we are going to see a drop in demand. I know that e-commerce volume has been strong and probably will be, but I think it's going to be a bit of a decline. That might have some other benefits, I suppose. It'll give us a chance to recover from all the congestion and a lot of the issues that we have suffered over the last few years, and give us an opportunity to get back onto a level keel and really get things right going forward. I suppose the Productivity Commission, again, in an Australian context, that we're quite hopeful there that the federal government picks up on some of the recommendations, aside from the industrial relations issues. We're looking to get some reform to the shipping competition laws in Australia. At the moment, the international shipping lines have an exemption from our competition law to manage their vessel sharing arrangements. We still want to encourage and incentivise the shipping lines to keep servicing Australia, so we don't want things to get too hard for them. But we believe that there needs to be an extra level of rigour over the exemptions that they are enjoying now. We do need some relief around container detention practices that the shipping lines have deployed. And again, we understand there is a need for detention and incentives for importers and to return containers in a timely fashion. But some of the methodologies we've seen have been just unreasonable, and we need a bit more protection there. The other big one that we've been pushing for is some type of relief around terminal access charges. So shipping lines would traditionally take all the costs from their supplies, the stevedores and the empty container parks. But over more recent years, those entities, the stevedores and the like, have been, I suppose, struggling to retain shipping line customers and win new ones, that they were looking at alternate means of collecting revenue, and they've found that the transport sector is a pretty soft target. And they implemented fees over the vehicle booking systems, which started as a few dollars, but it's now up around $150 plus per container and rapidly increasing. So again, in Australia, the Victorian government and the National Transport Commission had a go at trying to put together what they called a voluntary arrangement around this, but it was it proved to be pretty futile. And again, the Productivity Commission's looked at it and come up with a couple of recommendations which might give a lot more rigour to that. So we're hopeful that the federal government will pick up on some of the reforms. Bit of an easing of congestion at ports around the world will be welcomed. And hopefully 2023 will be a bit more of a year of consolidation, and that we can get things back on track and really rebuild again from there. I suppose the one dynamic that we'll really be watching with interest will be where the shipping lines go. They've reported multi-billion-dollar profits over the last few years, and a lot of them have reinvested it again in acquisitions, whether it's in logistics, even airlines now, rail, and even terminals and the like. So, while the shipping lines might be now in a position to provide an end-to-end service and provide economies of scale and efficiencies to importers and exporters, we just hope it's not done in a manner that excludes other logistics providers. And again, I know in an Australian context, our competition regulators keeping a close look at it under the terms of what they call exclusive dealings, to make sure that it's all done in appropriate manner.
Yeah, I think the end-to-end strategy of many of the major shipping asset holders is really interesting, and that's playing out all around the world. So it's a good point that you make. I suppose just to wrap, one of the upsides for the Australian market is the fact that there's been a lot of high-level government, federal government-to-government interaction between Australians and the Chinese at the moment, in recent weeks, in fact, and it looks very much like there's a bit of a thawing out of some of the chillier relations that have occurred over the last year or two, and there's a prospect of much stronger exports from Australia to China. So I guess we can see that as a bit of a bright spot on the horizon. Paul Zalai, co-founder of Freight and Trade Alliance and secretariat holder of the Australian Peak Shippers Association. Thanks so much for joining us today. Paul, how do people get hold of you? Obviously, you have a lot of members. You're always interested in more members. How do people contact you best?
Oh, thanks, Kim. I always enjoy a plug. Yeah, look, our website is FT Alliance, ALLIANCE.com.au. Or you could just Google Freight and Trade Alliance. But yeah, look, we'd be happy to talk to anybody and see what opportunities there are out there to keep improving the environment for the international trade sector. So, Kim, thanks again for the opportunity to speak to your audience today.
Absolute pleasure, Paul. Always great to talk to you. And you're fond of knowledge, especially around the Oceania market. So watch this space, because I'm likely to come back to you every 3 months for a bit of an update, see how things are going, and look forward to welcoming you back on the show.
Okay, thanks again, Kim.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to talking to you again soon.